Did you know that medieval education, often seen through a hazy, distorted lens, was not always what you think? Was everyone truly illiterate? Did science simply vanish for 1,000 years? Was learning just boring, chanting, and dogma? Prepare yourself for some startling facts about the minds and schools of the Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. Number 10. Learning was unpractical. Just religious dogma. Many think medieval learning was all about religion, with no real-world use. They picture scholars locked away, arguing about angels on a pinhead, disconnected from everyday life. This idea suggests that medieval education offered little beyond theological hair-splitting, providing no tangible skills for making a living or improving society. The assumption is that if it wasn't about God, it wasn't taught, and if it was taught, it had no practical application. This view often paints medieval society as stagnant and unconcerned with earthly matters, driven solely by spiritual devotion. However, the reality of medieval curricula and the roles of educated individuals paint a different picture entirely. Medieval society, like any other, needed skilled professionals. Cities and kingdoms required administrators, legal experts, and medical practitioners. Trade routes demanded individuals capable of managing accounts and understanding measurements. Building projects, from cathedrals to castles, called for knowledge of geometry and engineering principles. The notion that an entire epoch ignored such necessities, focusing only on the ethereal, simply does not hold up against the evidence. Law, for instance, was a hugely practical field. Universities like Bologna became famous centers for the study of both civil law, based on Roman legal codes, and canon law, the law of the church. Students spent years immersing themselves in complex legal texts, learning to argue cases, draft documents, and understand property rights, contracts, and criminal justice. Graduates became judges, lawyers, notaries, and royal administrators, essential figures in running kingdoms and managing local affairs. They advised kings, served in courts, and helped draft treaties. Their knowledge of legal precedents and principles was crucial for maintaining order and resolving disputes in a complex, evolving society. Without these legally trained professionals, the intricate systems of governance and commerce that developed across Europe would have crumbled. The sheer volume of legal documents from the period, from charters to court records, points to a vibrant legal profession rooted in rigorous university training. Medicine also flourished, far from being solely based on superstition or prayer. While spiritual healing was a part of life, medieval physicians received extensive training rooted in classical Greek and Arabic medical texts. Salerno in Italy, for example, was a renowned medical school, predating many universities where students studied anatomy, pharmacology, and clinical practice. Later, universities across Europe established strong medical faculties. Students learned about humors, diseases, and remedies, using herbal knowledge and even performing surgical procedures, though often with limited anesthesia. Physicians diagnosed ailments, prescribed treatments, and even performed some basic surgery, like setting bones or bleeding patients. They served noble courts, religious institutions, and increasingly urban populations, addressing common ailments and epidemics. Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, an Arabic scholar, was a standard textbook for centuries, showing the practical, observational basis of much medieval medical knowledge. Anatomical studies, though sometimes limited by religious constraints, did occur, and medieval surgeons performed impressive procedures, often learning from experience on battlefields. For commerce and daily life, practical mathematics and accounting skills were indispensable. While not always taught in formal universities, these skills were vital for merchants, guildmasters, and even monastic stewards managing vast estates. Apprentices in guilds learned to calculate profits, manage inventories, and understand weights and measures. Practical arithmetics, often using Arabic numerals which slowly replaced Roman ones, became more common. Merchants kept detailed account books, tracking sales, purchases, and debts across vast distances. These skills were not abstract. They were essential for the thriving trade networks that connected European towns with each other and with the wider world. The development of double-entry bookkeeping, a system still used today, has roots in late medieval Italian merchant practices. This demonstrates a clear focus on practical numerical literacy for economic prosperity. Even grammar and rhetoric, fundamental subjects in the arts curriculum, had clear practical applications. Grammar taught students how to read, write, and understand Latin, the language of scholarship, law, and diplomacy. This was essential for communicating across different regions and accessing written knowledge. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, trained individuals to be effective communicators in legal arguments, political discourse, and religious sermons. A skilled rhetorician could sway opinions, negotiate treaties, and deliver powerful addresses. These were not just intellectual exercises, they were tools for public life, for anyone who needed to present an argument, write a formal letter, or speak before a crowd. Medieval society valued eloquence and clear expression, recognizing their power in shaping public opinion and conducting official business. Furthermore, astronomy had very practical uses beyond just gazing at stars. It was critical for telling time, creating accurate calendars for agricultural cycles and religious festivals, and assisting navigation for sailors. Astrolabes and other instruments were developed and refined to measure celestial positions. Scribes and scholars created almanacs and tables that were essential for planning, from planting crops to setting sail on trading voyages. Architects and master builders also applied principles of geometry and physics, often learned through apprenticeships and practical experience, to construct magnificent cathedrals, bridges, and fortifications. The sheer scale and enduring nature of these structures show an advanced understanding of structural engineering and material science, derived from a blend of theoretical knowledge and hands-on application. The notion that medieval education was purely theoretical and unpractical ignores the vibrant professional classes that emerged from it. It overlooks the legal experts who codified laws, the physicians who tended the sick, the merchants who built economic empires, and the engineers who shaped the physical landscape. These individuals were products of an educational system that, while certainly rooted in religious understanding, also equipped them with concrete, marketable skills that were indispensable for the functioning and advancement of medieval society. The education provided was practical because society demanded practical solutions to its daily challenges and long-term needs. Number 9. Education ended early. No higher learning. There is a common belief that people in the Middle Ages had very short lives, and therefore their education must have also been cut short, with little opportunity for advanced study. The image often painted is one of basic literacy for a select few, then a quick entry into work or family life, with no further intellectual pursuits. This perspective suggests that the concept of prolonged, specialized higher education simply did not exist, or was extremely rare and reserved for an almost mythical few. It implies that once basic skills were acquired, formal learning ceased, and individuals spent the rest of their lives applying those rudimentary skills without deeper inquiry or professional development. However, the reality of medieval universities and the careers of many scholars reveal a very different story, demonstrating extensive and multi-layered academic journeys that could span decades. Medieval universities offered multiple levels of degrees, requiring years of dedicated study, much like modern higher education. A student would typically begin in the Faculty of Arts, which was a foundational program. This arts curriculum, often called the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, could take 6 to 7 years to complete. Students usually started this journey in their mid-teens, meaning they would often be in their early 20s upon earning a Master of Arts degree. The Master of Arts was not an endpoint for many. Instead, it served as a prerequisite for entry into the higher faculties. This foundational period of study was rigorous, demanding mastery of Latin, advanced reasoning skills, and a broad understanding of classical and philosophical texts. The sheer time commitment involved in just the arts degree contradicts the idea of a short educational path. After achieving a Master of Arts, ambitious students could then choose to pursue even more advanced degrees in one of the three higher faculties: law, medicine, or theology. Each of these specialized paths required many more years of intensive study. A student pursuing a doctorate in civil or canon law might spend another 5 to 10 years in legal studies delving into complex codes, legal precedents, and disputations. Similarly, a future doctor of medicine would spend several years after their arts degree studying medical texts, anatomy, and clinical practice. Theology, often considered the queen of the sciences, was the longest and most demanding course of study, potentially requiring more than 15 years beyond the arts degree to earn a doctorate. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas, for example, spent a significant portion of their lives, from their teenage years well into adulthood, engaged in continuous formal study and teaching within university settings. These lengthy academic careers meant that many individuals spent their entire young adult lives, and often much of their middle age, immersed in academic pursuits. They moved from student to scholar, then to professor, spending decades within the university system. Professors themselves continued to learn, conduct research, write commentaries, and engage in debates, constantly expanding their knowledge and contributing to their fields. Creation of vast scholastic works, multi-volume commentaries, and comprehensive legal or medical treatises would have been impossible without such extended periods of study and intellectual dedication. The very existence of these monumental works serves as a testament to the depth and duration of medieval higher learning. Furthermore, students often traveled across Europe to study at different universities, seeking out renowned scholars or specializing in particular subjects. A student might begin their arts degree in Oxford, then travel to Paris for theology, or Bologna for law. This mobility indicates a sophisticated and interconnected academic world where the pursuit of knowledge was a lifelong endeavor, not a short-term acquisition of basic skills. The financial investment and personal commitment required for such extended periods of study suggest that higher learning was a serious and highly valued pursuit, not a brief diversion. Families and patrons supported these long academic journeys, recognizing the significant professional and social benefits that a doctor's or master's degree conferred. The institutional framework of the medieval university, with its distinct faculties, levels of degrees, and extensive curricula, was designed for prolonged specialized learning. It was a system built for students to progress through stages of increasing complexity and expertise. Records of student registrations, graduation ceremonies, and the career paths of prominent scholars consistently show individuals dedicating substantial portions of their lives to formal education, culminating in advanced degrees that signified deep and comprehensive knowledge in their chosen field. The idea that education ended early, or that higher learning was almost non-existent, fundamentally misunderstands the sophisticated and extensive academic landscape of the medieval period. Number 8. There were no books, or they were rare. The image often presented of the Middle Ages is one of intellectual scarcity, a time when written knowledge was almost non-existent outside of a few monastic strongholds. This idea suggests that books were incredibly rare, almost mythical objects, chained to desks and accessible only to a tiny, privileged elite of monks or very wealthy nobles. The lack of the printing press during most of this period is often cited as the primary reason for this supposed dearth of books, leading to the assumption that education was limited by the extreme difficulty of obtaining any written materials. This perspective paints a picture of a largely oral culture where learning was passed down through spoken word due to the overwhelming absence of texts. However, the reality of medieval book production and circulation tells a much richer and more complex story, revealing a vibrant culture of manuscript creation and widespread access to written works across various segments of society. While it is true that books were expensive and produced by hand, they were far from non-existent. Monastic scriptoria, where monks diligently copied texts, were indeed significant centers of book production, preserving classical knowledge and religious texts. But as the Middle Ages progressed, especially with the rise of universities and urban centers, commercial scriptoria emerged. These were workshops where professional scribes, illuminators, and binders worked to produce books for a wider market. Students needed textbooks, lawyers needed law codes, physicians needed medical treatises, and even merchants needed practical manuals. This demand fueled a thriving book trade. Universities had their own stationers, who were licensed to produce and sell copies of texts, often renting out sections of books for students to copy themselves, making them more accessible. Libraries also existed beyond monastic walls. Universities established substantial libraries for their students and faculty. The Sorbonne in Paris, for example, built an impressive library with thousands of volumes by the late Middle Ages, carefully catalogued and organized. Cathedrals and wealthy churches also maintained significant collections. Moreover, private book ownership was not uncommon among the educated elite. Kings and nobles, especially by the later Middle Ages, amassed personal libraries containing not only religious works, but also histories, romances, and even scientific texts. Inventories of private estates show that books were valued, possessions passed down through generations. Even some prosperous merchants and urban professionals owned small collections of books for practical or recreational reading. The very nature of medieval scholarship demonstrates the availability of books. Scholars constantly referred to, commented upon, and synthesized vast numbers of texts. Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, for instance, cites hundreds of different sources from ancient philosophers to church fathers, demonstrating that a vast corpus of written knowledge was accessible to him and his contemporaries. University lectures involved reading and commenting on established texts, requiring both professors and students to have access to these materials, whether their own copies or through shared resources. The intellectual debates and detailed commentaries characteristic of scholasticism would have been impossible without a substantial body of accessible written works. Furthermore, innovations in materials and book formats also contributed to wider availability. While parchment and vellum, animal skins, remained the primary materials for high-quality books, the increasing availability of paper, especially from the 13th century onwards, made book production significantly cheaper and faster. This led to an explosion in the number of books produced, particularly for university texts and administrative documents. The development of smaller, more portable book formats also made texts easier to carry and use, moving them beyond the large, often chained volumes found in monastic libraries. These pocket-sized Bibles or legal handbooks show a desire for more personal and accessible reading material. The vast number of surviving medieval manuscripts housed in libraries and archives across the globe is the most direct evidence against the myth of their rarity. Tens of thousands of manuscripts, covering every imaginable subject from theology and law to poetry, medicine, and astronomy, have come down to us. This existing corpus represents only a fraction of what was originally produced, as many books have been lost over time due to war, fire, neglect, or simply the fragility of the materials. The sheer volume of surviving texts undeniably demonstrates that medieval society was far from book-starved, Rather, it was a culture that valued, produced, and consumed written knowledge on a scale that often surprises those accustomed to the narrative of scarcity. Number 7. Learning was solely rote memorization. Persistent myth suggests that medieval education was a monotonous grind of rote memorization, where students simply repeated facts without understanding or critical thought. The image painted is one of passive learners endlessly chanting Latin phrases, copying texts word for word and regurgitating information without any engagement with the material's meaning or deeper implication. This view often portrays medieval scholars as mere compilers of existing knowledge, devoid of originality or analytical skills, and implies that the educational system actively discouraged questioning or independent reasoning. It implies a static, unthinking, intellectual environment where the primary goal was faithful reproduction of established truths rather than exploration or debate. However, the pedagogical methods employed in medieval universities and schools, particularly the scholastic method, reveal a profound emphasis on logic, critical analysis, and rigorous debate, far beyond simple memorization. While memorization of foundational texts, such as grammatical rules, logical principles, and important passages from authorities like Aristotle or the Bible, was certainly a component of medieval learning, it was primarily a starting point for deeper intellectual work. Students were expected to internalize this knowledge not as an end in itself, but as the raw material for analysis and argumentation. True core of medieval higher education, especially in the university arts faculties and higher faculties, was the scholastic method, a sophisticated system of inquiry that demanded acute critical thinking and analytical skills. The scholastic method revolved around the question or quaestio. Problem or proposition would be posed, often one where different authoritative texts seemed to contradict each other. Students and masters would then engage in a process of structured debate known as disputation. This involved presenting arguments for the proposition, citing relevant authorities, and then presenting arguments against it, also drawing from authoritative sources. The master would then offer a determination or resolution, demonstrating how the apparent contradictions could be reconciled through careful logical distinctions, nuanced interpretations, or a deeper understanding of the subject matter. This process was far from simple regurgitation. It required students to identify logical fallacies, construct coherent arguments, and critically evaluate the positions of various authorities. Consider the works of Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica is a prime example of scholastic methodology. It is structured entirely as a series of questions, each broken down into objections, arguments for the opposing view, and then Aquinas' own nuanced resolution. To engage with such a text, let alone to produce one, required highly developed skills in logic, dialectic, and the ability to synthesize vast amounts of information into a coherent and defensible position. Students were trained to participate in these disputations, which were regular and central features of university life. They learned to articulate their thoughts clearly, defend their positions against challenges, and respond to counter-arguments. This active, dialectical approach cultivated intellectual agility and critical reasoning, not passive absorption. Furthermore, the study of logic, a core component of the trivium, provided students with the intellectual tools necessary for this kind of rigorous analysis. Logic taught formal reasoning, syllogisms, and how to identify valid and invalid arguments. This was not a subject to be merely memorized. It was a skill set to be applied in every other area of study, from theology to law to medicine. Students were expected to dissect arguments, identify underlying assumptions, and construct precise definitions. These were not the hallmarks of an education based solely on rote learning, but rather of one designed to foster intellectual rigor and analytical precision. Copying of manuscripts, while a form of physical reproduction, also involved active engagement, especially for scribes who sometimes added their own notes, corrections, or marginalia. Moreover, many students created their own notebooks, summarizing lectures and organizing their thoughts, demonstrating a proactive approach to learning beyond simple passive reception. The sheer volume of commentaries produced on classical and religious texts also shows an active intellectual engagement. Scholars were not just repeating Aristotle or Plato, they were analyzing, interpreting, and applying their ideas to new contexts, often developing them further. The medieval educational system, while certainly structured and emphasizing foundational knowledge, was fundamentally designed to cultivate critical thinkers and skilled debaters, capable of engaging with complex ideas and navigating intellectual contemplation. Number 6. Teachers were brutal and abusive. The popular image of medieval schooling often includes a stern, scolding teacher wielding a whip or rod, dispensing harsh physical punishment for every minor infraction. This perception suggests that classrooms were places of fear and intimidation, where learning was enforced through brute force and physical pain, rather than encouragement or intellectual stimulation. It conjures a picture of teachers as purely disciplinary figures, unconcerned with the individual needs or well-being of their students, focused solely on enforcing obedience through corporal punishment. This view often comes from anecdotal accounts or historical exaggerations, leading to a generalization that all medieval teachers were inherently cruel and that violence was the primary pedagogical tool. However, while discipline certainly was strict by modern standards, the reality of medieval teaching methods and the prevailing pedagogical philosophies reveal a more nuanced approach, one that often emphasized encouragement, moral guidance, and even a degree of compassion. It is undeniable that corporal punishment was a recognized and accepted disciplinary tool in medieval schools, much like in many societies up until relatively recent times. Misbehavior, laziness, or failure to perform could indeed lead to a beating with a rod or switch. This was seen not as an act of cruelty, but as a necessary means to instill discipline, moral character, and diligence in students, drawing on the biblical injunction, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Some contemporary accounts, often from students themselves, do vividly describe these punishments. However, to focus solely on this aspect is to miss the broader context of medieval pedagogy and the advice given to teachers. Many medieval educational treatises and school statutes, while allowing for corporal punishment, also advised moderation and emphasized the importance of other teaching methods. For instance, texts like Vincent of Beauvais' De Eruditio Filiorum Nobilium, on the education of noble and sons, or Hugh of St. Victor's Didascalicon discussed teaching methods that went far beyond mere physical correction. They stressed the importance of a teacher's good character, their knowledge, and their ability to inspire students. Teachers were often seen as moral guides, responsible not only for intellectual instruction but also for shaping the student's character and spiritual development. They were encouraged to be patient, clear in their explanations, and to foster a love of learning. Moreover, the relationship between masters and students in universities was often one of intellectual mentorship and shared scholarly pursuit. While masters held authority, the emphasis was on intellectual debate and challenging students to think critically, not just on punitive measures. University disputations, where students and masters engaged in formal arguments, required a level of intellectual respect and a shared commitment to rational inquiry. The focus was on challenging ideas and refining arguments, not on silencing dissent through fear. Many university statutes also outlined rules for respectful conduct between students and masters, suggesting a professional relationship rather than a purely hierarchical one based on fear. Teachers themselves were often scholars, often educated in the same system, who believed in the value of their subjects and the importance of intellectual inquiry. They fostered environments where students were encouraged to ask questions, debate points, and delve deeply into texts. While the fear of punishment might have prompted some students to learn true intellectual progress, and the development of complex arguments required engagement and motivation that went beyond coercion. Many students freely chose to attend university, driven by the desire for knowledge and career advancement, suggesting that the learning environment, while disciplined, was not universally terrifying. Accounts of students forming strong bonds with their teachers, respecting their intellectual prowess, and even following them from one university to another, further demonstrate that the relationship was not solely one of oppressor and oppressed. Some teachers were renowned for their clarity of explanation, their inspiring lectures, or their ability to mentor promising young minds. While the medieval classroom might seem harsh from a modern perspective, viewing all teachers as uniformly brutal abusers oversimplifies a complex reality that included various approaches to discipline, a strong emphasis on moral guidance, and a deep commitment to intellectual instruction. Number 5. Universities taught only theology. Common misconception is that medieval universities were exclusively theological seminaries focused solely on religious doctrine and scripture, to the exclusion of all other fields of knowledge. This view suggests that the pursuit of truth was entirely confined to spiritual matters, and that subjects like law, medicine, or the arts were either not taught at all or were considered secondary and insignificant. It implies a narrow academic scope, where intellectual inquiry was strictly limited to what was deemed acceptable by religious authority, stifling any broader scientific or humanistic pursuits. This perspective often arises from the prominence of theology in certain universities and the Church's pervasive influence in medieval society. However, a closer look at the actual structure and curricula of medieval universities reveals a diverse landscape of learning, with multiple faculties dedicated to a wide range of subjects. The medieval university typically comprised several distinct faculties, with the Faculty of Arts often serving as the foundational school, prerequisite to all others. This Faculty of Arts offered a curriculum rooted in the liberal arts, which were far from being solely theological. Students in the arts faculty studied the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Grammar involved the study of Latin language, literature, and composition. Rhetoric taught the art of persuasive speaking and writing. Logic, perhaps the most important, provided the tools for critical thinking, argument construction, and philosophical inquiry, drawing heavily on Aristotle. Quadrivium introduced students to mathematical and scientific concepts. Astronomy, for example, was studied for its practical applications in calendar making and navigation, as well as its philosophical implications. These subjects formed a broad intellectual base, equipping students with essential skills in language, reasoning, and basic mathematics, without directly focusing on theology. After completing their studies in the Faculty of Arts, typically earning a Bachelor of Arts and then a Master of Arts degree, students could then proceed to one of the higher faculties if they wished to specialize. These higher faculties were distinct from theology and offered advanced professional training. The Faculty of Law was hugely popular and highly influential, particularly at universities like Bologna and Orleans. Here, students studied both canon law, the law of the Church, and civil law, based on Roman legal codes, preparing them for careers as lawyers, judges, notaries, and administrators in both ecclesiastical and secular courts and governments. This was a rigorous, practical course of study that had direct bearing on the administration of justice and governance throughout Europe. The Faculty of Medicine, found at universities such as Salerno, Padua, and Montpellier, trained physicians and surgeons. Students in these faculties studied classical medical texts, engaged in anatomical studies, sometimes through dissection, though often limited, learned about pharmacology, and received instruction in diagnosing and treating illnesses. This was a vital and highly practical field. addressing the fundamental human need for health and healing. Medieval medicine, while different from modern practices, was built on observation, textual study, and a growing understanding of the human body, not just religious dogma. While theology was indeed a prestigious and important faculty in many universities, particularly Paris, it was one among several. For many students, the ultimate goal was not to become a theologian, but a lawyer, a physician, or an educated administrator. Universities like Bologna became famous primarily for their law faculties, while Salerno was known for medicine. Paris, while strong in theology, was also a leading center for the arts. Intellectual life of these institutions was rich and varied, encompassing a wide spectrum of human knowledge and professional training. Curricula show a clear commitment to educating individuals for diverse roles within society, from the highest levels of church leadership to the practical needs of civic administration, legal practice, and medical care. Claiming that medieval universities focused only on theology is to ignore the wealth of evidence regarding their multidisciplinary structure and the broad range of subjects taught within their walls. Number 4. Only boys received education. It is a common belief that in the Middle Ages, education was an exclusive privilege reserved strictly for boys and men, reinforcing the idea of a patriarchal society where women were confined to domestic roles with no intellectual pursuits. This myth suggests that formal schooling, literacy, and scholarly pursuits were entirely outside the realm of possibility for girls and women, implying a systematic exclusion from all forms of learning. The picture painted is one of women primarily engaged in household chores, raising children, or agricultural labor, with their minds uncultivated and their voices unheard in intellectual discourse. However, historical evidence clearly shows that while opportunities certainly differed by social class and location, medieval girls and women did receive various forms of education, sometimes achieving remarkable levels of literacy. For noble and wealthy families, girls often received an education, though it was frequently conducted at home or in convents, rather than public schools. Tutors were hired to teach noble daughters how to read, write, and manage household accounts, which was crucial for managing large estates and serving as chatelaines in their husband's absence. They might also learn French or other vernacular languages, music, embroidery, and sometimes even Latin, particularly if they were destined for a convent or if their families valued intellectual pursuits. Historical records and personal letters demonstrate that many aristocratic women were literate and engaged with literature. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was a patron of poets and had a profound influence on courtly culture, suggesting an educated mind. Convents played a crucial role in the education of women, particularly for those from noble or wealthy backgrounds. Nuns, often literate themselves, provided instruction to young girls who were either destined to become nuns or were sent there for a period of education before returning to secular life. In these convents, girls learned to read and write, primarily Latin for liturgical purposes, but also vernacular languages. They studied scripture, patristic texts, and sometimes even classical literature, music, and various crafts. Some convents were renowned centers of learning, producing highly educated abbesses and scholars. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and natural scientist, whose extensive body of work demonstrates a profound and diverse education. Hartsbitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote Latin dramas and poetry, showing exceptional literary skill. These women were not exceptions, but products of educational opportunities within monastic settings. Even outside the elite, some women, particularly in urban areas and among merchant families, received practical education. Daughters of merchants sometimes learned basic literacy and numeracy to assist with family businesses, manage accounts, and handle correspondence. Guilds, which often had female members or were run by widows, also sometimes provided training to girls or apprentices. While less formal than university education, this practical schooling equipped women with essential skills for economic participation and household management. Wills and other legal documents sometimes refer to women who owned books or were capable of writing, indicating their literacy, while direct access to universities was generally not open to women. There were exceptions or workarounds. Some women were known to attend lectures informally, and a few notable women, like Trotula of Salerno, were prominent medical practitioners and teachers whose works were studied. Absence of women from formal university roles does not equate to a complete lack of education or intellectual engagement. Women scholars, authors, and artists, such as Christine de Pizan, who wrote extensively in the late 14th and early 15th centuries on historical, political, and moral subjects, represent the achievements of educated medieval women. Christine de Pizan, daughter of a university professor, received an exceptional education at home and became a highly respected and prolific author, demonstrating that intellectual pursuits were not exclusively male. The varying degrees of education for medieval girls and women depended significantly on their social status, family wealth, and geographic location. While universal public education for girls was not a feature of the Middle Ages, significant avenues for learning existed. The existence of literate noblewomen, educated nuns, female authors, and women involved in commerce who required literacy for their work decisively counters the sweeping claim that only boys received education during this long historical period. Number 3. Science did not exist or was suppressed. A pervasive myth about the Middle Ages is that it was a period entirely devoid of scientific inquiry, a dark age where rational thought was stifled by religious dogma and superstition. This narrative suggests that scientific advancement halted after the fall of Rome, only to be rekindled much later during the Renaissance. It often implies that the Church actively suppressed any form of scientific investigation that might challenge its doctrines, leaving no room for observation, experimentation, or the development of mathematical and astronomical understanding. This view paints medieval scholars as either blindly following ancient authorities or solely focusing on theological contemplation, with no interest in the natural world. However, medieval scholars engaged in robust and sophisticated scientific pursuits, building upon classical knowledge and making significant contributions across various fields. Medieval scholars were deeply engaged with natural philosophy, which was the precursor to modern science. They meticulously preserved, translated, and studied ancient Greek texts, particularly those of Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy, which formed the bedrock of their scientific understanding. Without the tireless efforts of medieval monks and scholars in translating these texts, much of classical knowledge might have been lost to the Western world. They did not merely copy, they analyzed, debated, and expanded upon these ancient ideas. Universities, far from suppressing inquiry, became centers for the study of logic, mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy as part of the arts curriculum. In mathematics, medieval scholars made crucial advancements, particularly by adopting and developing the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, including the concept of zero. This system, introduced to Europe largely through Arabic translations, revolutionized calculation and laid the groundwork for modern arithmetic and algebra. Leonardo Fofami, a 13th century Italian mathematician, introduced these numerals and methods to Europe through his book Liber Abaci, profoundly impacting commerce and scientific calculation. Scholars also worked on geometry and trigonometry, applying these principles in architecture and engineering. Astronomy was another vibrant field. Building upon Ptolemy's geocentric model, medieval astronomers observed celestial bodies, refined existing tables, and developed instruments like the astrolabe. They were concerned with accurate calendar keeping for religious festivals, as well as for practical purposes like navigation. Scholars like Jean Buridan and Nicole Loresme in the 14th century even debated concepts related to the Earth's rotation, anticipating later Copernican ideas. While they worked within a geocentric framework, their meticulous observations and mathematical calculations were foundational. Optics also saw significant development. Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, conducted experiments with lenses and mirrors, contributing to the understanding of light and vision. His work laid some groundwork for later inventions like eyeglasses, which appeared in late medieval Italy. Scholars investigated the nature of light, reflection, and refraction, delving into what was then a complex and fascinating area of physics. Medicine, as mentioned earlier, was a practical and scientific pursuit. Medieval physicians studied anatomy, pharmacology, and recognized the importance of clinical observation. The medical schools of Salerno and Padua were particularly noted for their empirical approaches. Scholars like Albertus Magnus, a 13th century Dominican friar and teacher of Thomas Aquinas, conducted extensive observations of plants, animals, and minerals, often described as proto-biological research. He challenged some of Aristotle's views based on his own empirical findings, demonstrating a spirit of independent inquiry. Alchemy, often seen as mere mysticism, was a complex blend of chemistry, philosophy, and metallurgy. While it pursued the elusive goal of transmuting base metals into gold, alchemists developed laboratory techniques, learned about chemical reactions, and identified various substances, contributing chemical restances. Similarly, developments in metallurgy and mining driven by practical needs led to innovations in materials, science, and engineering. The very concept of science was interwoven with philosophy and theology in the medieval period, known as natural philosophy. Medieval thinkers believed that studying the natural world was a way to understand God's creation, thus integrating their faith with empirical observation and logical reasoning. Far from suppressing inquiry, institutions like universities provided a structured environment for its pursuit. The intellectual lineage from ancient Greek science through medieval Islamic and European scholarship directly paved the way for the scientific revolution, showing a continuous thread of scientific activity, not a thousand-year void. Number 2. Everyone was illiterate. A widespread belief is that in the Middle Ages, almost the entire population was illiterate, unable to read or write, save for a tiny fraction of monks and high-ranking clergy. This myth paints a picture of a largely ignorant society where communication relied almost entirely on oral tradition, and written documents were mysterious symbols beyond the grasp of the common person. It often suggests that literacy was seen as unnecessary or even dangerous for the general populace, leading to a profound intellectual darkness for the vast majority of people. This view implies a society profoundly disconnected from written knowledge, with limited access to information beyond what was heard or seen. However, historical evidence consistently shows that while universal literacy did not exist, reading and writing skills were far more widespread and functionally diverse than commonly assumed. While monks were indeed crucial custodians of literacy and learning, especially in the early Middle Ages, literacy rates steadily increased throughout the period, particularly from the 11th century onwards with the growth of towns, commerce, and universities. Functional literacy, meaning the ability to read and write sufficiently for daily tasks, was present in various segments of society. Merchants, for instance, absolutely needed to be literate and numerate. Thriving trade networks demanded the ability to keep accounts, write letters, draw up contracts, and record transactions across vast distances. Detailed ledger books from merchant families in Italy, Flanders, and other trading hubs show sophisticated bookkeeping practices that required robust literacy and mathematical skills. Without these abilities, their complex commercial enterprises would have been impossible to manage. Guilds, which organized artisans and tradespeople, also often required their members, especially masters, to be able to read and write, to manage their affairs, keep records, and communicate within their professional networks. Town clerks, notaries, and administrative officials in growing urban centers were another group with essential literacy skills. They drafted legal documents, recorded court proceedings, managed civic records, and corresponded with other towns and rulers. Proliferation of urban charters, administrative records, and local laws points to a significant literate bureaucracy at the municipal level. These were lay people, often from middle-class backgrounds, whose professions entirely depended on their ability to read and write effectively. Even among the nobility, literacy was more common than often assumed, particularly in the later Middle Ages, while some nobles might have preferred oral delivery of stories and correspondence. Many were fully literate, reading romances, histories, and even practical treatises. Women of noble birth, as mentioned earlier, often received instruction in reading and writing at home or in convents. Personal letters from nobles, often written in their own hand, attest to their literacy. The very existence of numerous vernacular literary works, such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian romances, indicates a growing audience of lay readers who could enjoy literature in their native tongues, not just Latin. The rise of elementary schools, often called grammar schools, town schools, and chantry schools, endowed for the specific purpose of educating children, also contributed to expanding literacy. These schools were not exclusively for future clergy. Sons of merchants, prosperous artisans, and even some farmers who could afford the fees might attend to gain basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, skills preparing them for a variety of professions. Even girls, as discussed sometimes, received education in these settings. Or at home, the advent of paper, which became increasingly available and cheaper than parchment from the 13th century onwards, also facilitated the wider production and circulation of written materials. This made books, pamphlets, and official documents more accessible, further encouraging literacy among those beyond the clerical elite. While literacy rates were certainly lower than in modern industrialized societies with universal education, the idea of universal illiteracy in the Middle Ages is a drastic oversimplification that ignores the vibrant literate cultures and the educational opportunities that existed for various segments of medieval society. Many people, for both practical and personal reasons, were able to read and write. Number 1. Education was only for the clergy. The most enduring myth about medieval education is perhaps the notion that only those destined for the church, such as monks, priests, and nuns, received any formal schooling. This idea often presents the Middle Ages as a time when intellectual pursuits were exclusively spiritual, confined to religious institutions, and entirely inaccessible to lay people. It suggests that if you weren't going to become a clergyman or woman, your educational opportunities were essentially non-existent, leaving the vast majority of the population in intellectual darkness. This perspective implies a sharp divide between the sacred and the secular in terms of knowledge and learning, with the latter being entirely neglected. However, historical evidence unequivocally demonstrates that medieval education, though often influenced by the church, served a much broader purpose, preparing individuals for diverse roles within both religious and secular society. While the church certainly played a paramount role in preserving learning, especially after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and monastic schools were foundational, education gradually expanded beyond ecclesiastical control throughout the Middle Ages. The emergence and growth of universities from the 11th and 12th centuries onwards clearly show that a significant portion of higher education was geared towards training lay professionals. As discussed, universities offered faculties of law, medicine, and arts, in addition to theology. Students enrolled in these faculties were often aspiring lawyers, physicians, administrators, or masters of the liberal arts, many of whom had no intention of entering the clergy. For example, the faculty of law at Bologna was overwhelmingly attended by lay students who sought to apply their legal knowledge in civil courts and government service. Similarly, medical students aimed for careers treating the sick, not preaching sermons. Below the university level, a variety of schools catered to the educational needs of lay children, Town schools, often founded by civic authorities or wealthy citizens rather than just bishops, emerged in urban centers to provide basic literacy and numeracy. These schools prepared boys, and sometimes girls, for careers in commerce, administration, or skilled trades. Guilds also played a role in education, often requiring apprentices to learn basic reading and writing as part of their training in a craft. This was essential for understanding contracts, keeping records, and communicating within their trades. These schools were not clerical institutions. They were practical establishments serving the needs of an increasingly complex and commercially active society. Chantry schools were another significant avenue for lay education. Endowed by wealthy individuals or families, these schools were typically attached to churches but designed to provide free or affordable education to local boys, often with a focus on basic literacy, Latin grammar, and arithmetic. While they might include religious instruction, their primary purpose was to equip students with skills for secular careers, such as becoming clerks, merchants, or even entering the lower ranks of the bureaucracy. The founders of these schools often had lay students in mind, demonstrating a clear desire to foster education beyond the religious sphere. Even within noble households, education was not exclusively religious. Noble children, both boys and girls, often received tutoring at home, learning skills essential for managing estates, engaging in diplomacy, or navigating courtly life. This education could include literacy, numeracy, history, languages, and sometimes even law or rhetoric, preparing them for leadership roles in secular society. Knights, for instance, while receiving military training, were also expected to have a degree of literacy and knowledge of chivalric codes, which were often disseminated through written romances and treatises. The increasing demand for literate lay administrators in burgeoning royal chancelleries, urban governments, and private estates also fueled the need for secular education. Kings and powerful nobles needed educated individuals to manage their finances, administer justice, and conduct diplomacy. These positions were often filled by laymen, who had received their education in grammar schools or universities, specializing in law or the arts. The very structure of medieval society, with its complex legal systems and administrative hierarchies, required a significant number of educated lay individuals to function effectively. The widespread existence of these diverse educational institutions and the varied career paths of their graduates decisively refute the idea that education in the Middle Ages was solely the domain of the clergy.